Hello, this is Angela from Natural Living Alchemy. Welcome to my channel. In today's video, we are going to be making a sourdough starter from scratch. Now, I want to warn you before we get started, this is going to be a practice in patience. You're going to need to expect this process of creating a starter to take up to a few weeks to actually get established. And then once your starter is established, it could take a few more weeks until it is fully matured. However, once it is established, you are ready to use it and ready to bake some bread. We are going to be talking about the types of flour that you will want to use, including some gluten-free recommendations. We're going to talk about types of water, the science of sourdough, and what is really going on, why you need to learn to read the starter, and my best starter maintenance practices and tips. So let's begin by talking about the science of sourdough. I don't know, I like to geek out on some of these things. I like to know what's going on. Why does this work? How does this work? Well, basically, sourdough is a symbiotic fermentation between wild yeasts and lactic acid bacteria. So the wild yeast will consume the sugar in the flour, producing carbon dioxide, and that is what leavens the dough. These yeasts are slower but much hardier than commercial strains of yeast, and they thrive in acidic environments, which is exactly what lactic acid bacteria will provide. The lactic acid bacteria converts sugar into lactic acid and acetic acid, which is what develops the signature tang of sourdough bread. This bacteria helps preserve the bread as well as inhibit the growth of pathogenic or harmful bacteria. What I find really fascinating is this symbiotic relationship between wild yeast and lactic acid bacteria has its roots stretching back over 5,000 years, dating all the way back to around 1500 BCE in ancient Egypt. The only ingredients that you are going to require to make a sourdough starter is honestly just flour and water. That is it. Let's talk about flour. So one thing that I'm not going to be telling you is what brands of flour that you need to use, because I have no idea what you have access to. So for example, I keep hearing so many great things about Costco house brand, the Kirkland Organic AP flour, which is supposed to be like the cream of the crop, one of the best flours that you can use for sourdough. Well, that's fun, but my Costco doesn't carry it. So I'm not going to tell you that you have to go out and get that flour. So instead of being concerned with flour brands, we are going to be more concerned with flour types. So there is 4 different suggestions that I'm going to be giving you on what you want to use for your flour type for your sourdough starter. Our first type of flour would be just regular unbleached flour. This is the bare minimum of what you will require. This flour can be relied on for consistency as well as general availability. Next, we have whole grain flour, and this would be our whole wheat. So this ferments quickly because it does contain more nutrients. You could also use rye flour. Now, if you are using rye flour, you want to make sure that you can find the dark whole grain rye flour, not the light rye flour. There is a difference. But rye flour is extremely starter friendly, and this also helps speed up fermentation due to that nutrient content. And lastly, this is what I'm going to be using in our tutorial today, is it's going to be a blend of 50% all-purpose or bread flour you could also use alongside 50% whole grain. And I am going to be using dark rye. So this is an ideal blend if you don't want to use all-purpose or all whole grain. Now, if you do mix this up, we're going to mix up a batch of it in the beginning, and we're just going to scoop out what we need from there, just so it's easy once we have to go and do our feeding steps. Now, one thing that is good to keep in mind is just because you begin this journey with one type of flour does not mean you always have to stick with that type of flour. So I'm going to suggest that you do this 50-50 blend like what I'm going to do for the first few days. And then you could definitely switch to all-purpose or all whole wheat or all rye once the starter has become active. But just keep in mind, active does not mean ready to use, and I'm going to talk about what I mean by that in just a few minutes. If you were wanting to make a gluten-free sourdough starter, your options here would be brown rice flour, sorghum flour, buckwheat flour, teff flour, and millet flour. So you could use a single flour or a blend, but just keep in mind that brown rice flour is a common base to use in gluten-free recipes here. All flours will actually absorb water differently, and this is really especially true for gluten-free flours. So you may need to adjust the water until you get your desired consistency if you are going the gluten-free route. So water. Room temperature water is going to be ideal, and I'm going to talk about types of water in just a second. Now, one thing that I like to do is just leave this little glass of water on my counter at all times for when I am doing my discard and my feedings, but I will get to that when we get to that part of this video. So the reason that we want room temperature water is we're using room temperature flour. We want things to stay at a consistent temperature as much as possible. Your temperature of your ingredients and your room are going to affect how active the yeast and the lactic acid bacteria is. You can use tap water. It will work just fine as long as it is not heavily chlorinated and does not contain any chloramine. Now, according to the CDC, chloramine is a chemical compound of chlorine and ammonia, and this is commonly used as a disinfectant in water treatment. It is less aggressive chemical than chlorine, and it does help prevent bacterial growth in water systems. To remove chloramine from water, reverse osmosis is your best method. However, reverse osmosis is going to remove everything out of your water, including some of the minerals that we actually require that are naturally found in water. To remove chlorine from your water, you just need to allow it to sit in an open container for 24 hours and allow the chlorine to evaporate, and that will remove 60 to 99.999% of the chlorine. Activated carbon filters may also help reduce the amount of chloramine as well as chlorine. Keep also in mind that hard water is better than soft water because hard water contains minerals such as calcium and magnesium, and our wild yeast and beneficial bacteria love those minerals. You could also just use filtered water or spring. So where I live, we are on well water. If you have well water, definitely try that out. Mine has a really good mineral composition. I can't say that's going to be true for all of them, so you're just going to want to give it a try. What you do not want to use is distilled or purified water. We need our water to be alive for this process to work properly. And keep in mind that distilled water is not actually intended for daily use, and it can lead to mineral deficiencies and electrolyte imbalances. Now let's talk about reading the starter, and there's just a few things I want to briefly go over here. Now, in order for you to determine once your starter is active and it is ready to be fed, you're going to need to look at a combinations of signs to see if it needs to be fed or not. We can't rely on how much the starter has risen in the container. That is not enough. But we do need to see that our starter has doubled in height, okay, by at least twice. You're going to want to notice if there's bubbles on the top as well as the sides. You're going to also keep in mind if the top of the starter looks domed as if it is still rising, or if it looks flat as if it is not rising, or it starts to sink down, you've passed peak and it's already starting to fall. And you're also going to want to smell it. It should smell sour but have a pleasant aroma, and it should also have a somewhat elastic consistency. If you notice any liquid sitting on the top, this could range anywhere from like a clear water type liquid all the way to like a purple or gray liquid. That is called hooch, and that is a byproduct of this process. It is a harmless byproduct. It could just be dumped out or mixed back in if you do happen to notice it. I've actually never had any of my starters develop it. I'm not sure why. It could just be because I don't let them get hungry, but we're going to talk about that when I do talk about the maintenance portion. But just know, when it comes time to feed your starter, you can't just rely on how much it's risen. You need to also look at the different bubbles and the different aromas and all the things like that. I would like to now talk about a concept called false rise. Now, this happens once things start to get going and your wild yeast and your bacteria have started to do their thing. this is where you're going to experience false rise, and absolutely every starter is going to go through this. So you start to notice bubbles throughout the mixture and all along the sides and on the top of the starter, and you might even notice that things have risen and that they start to fall. And it's really, really easy to get excited at that point, thinking that things are ready to go and that you're ready to make some bread. But you're not there yet. Now, what's going to happen after this initial burst of activity is there is going to be an extended period of inactivity. And this is where a lot of people, including myself, have quit. Okay? But I need you to keep going, because what's happened is that rise actually came from a specific strain of bacteria, not yeast. What we are wanting in our sourdough starter is we are wanting the yeast to rise the sourdough, not the bacteria. So what's happening here is actually a little bit of a balancing act, and we are having what I playfully call the battle between good and evil, or the battle between the pathogenic and the beneficial bacteria. And we need to let this happen, because as this happens, things are going to start evening out, and the beneficial bacteria are going to take over essentially and keep any pathogenic bacteria at bay. So you definitely just don't want to use the starter when it has this false rise. You're going to allow it to sit through a period of inactivity, and then it's going to be ready to go and ready to be used. Now, before we get started in mixing everything up, I just want to invite you to check the description box below this video. And in there, you're going to find a link to the full written blog article so that you can see all of this information in written form. Now, another thing that you will find in that description box is also going to be a link to the complete sourdough beginner's tutorial guide that I did recently. And in that, I talk about some other equipment suggestions in case you don't have any of these things. I'm going to point you into that video. You're going to also need to watch it if you've never made bread before anyways, but I do have some other suggestions on things that you can use in that video. Okay, so just keep that in mind. If you don't have everything that I am going to be suggesting that you need, use what you have and then just see what else you need to acquire. So the equipment that you are going to require to make your sourdough starter is going to be 1 to 2 clean glass jars with non-airtight fitting lids. Non-negotiable is going to be our kitchen scale. You're going to need a spoon or spatula or something that you can use to stir your flour and your water together. You're going to need a thermometer. Mine came in a little sourdough kit. I like to use this little rubber band so it can help track what time I fed it as well as the growth of the starter. If you're making your flour blend, you're going to need a bowl and a jar to store it in. And optionally, pH strips. Okay, it is not, or a pH meter if you have one. The one I have, I use solely when I'm making lotion and other creams and stuff like that. So I don't want it to be contaminated with my food stuff. So I'm just going to be using these little strips, because it is a good idea to ensure that our sourdough starter is at the proper pH to make sure that any pathogenic bacteria is not able to grow and thrive. When it comes to your jars, I want to just go over this quickly. So I like to use these WEC jars. I've also purchased a sourdough kit that came with something like this. I do like the top of this one more than the top of this one, because there's a bit of a lip on this one. It is actually kind of hard to get everything out and to clean it. I do find it a lot easier to use these jars. However, if you are going to be using the WEC jars, I am going to suggest you do not purchase them off of Amazon unless you want to pay 2 to 3 times as much. I found mine just at a local store, a Canadian Tire where I live. If you don't have any of these at your local store, I'm going to suggest going directly to the WEC website. It is a lot more cost efficient. I don't want you overpaying for things if we don't have to. Okay. Now, what we are going to do first is we are going to be mixing up our flour blend. Now, I am going to be using a mixture of 50% all-purpose and 50% dark rye. So what I'm going to do is mix those up in a bowl now so that I have my flour all ready to go when it is time to use it. If you are not wanting to use a 50-50 blend, you don't have to. Just determine what type of flour you are going to be using and just make sure that you have an appropriate amount. So we are going to start by putting 150 grams of all-purpose flour into our bowl. And then hitting tare on your digital scale, you're going to add 150 grams of whole grain flour. Keep in mind, if you only had all-purpose, you could just definitely use that. The main thing is you want to make sure that it is unbleached flour. And then you just want to grab something like a whisk and you want to make sure that these flours are nicely mixed in and everything is well incorporated. Perfect. Once everything is mixed in, I like to just look at the bottom of the bowl to make sure that everything is incorporated. We're just going to put it in a clean jar. Okay. So once you have your flour blend ready to go, we are ready to start mixing up our starter. So what you will do is grab a clean jar. We're going to place it on our digital scale. And in this jar, we are going to put 30 grams of our flour. Whether it is your flour blend or just one type of flour, that's fine. We just need to put 30 grams into our jar. And then next, you're going to hit tare on your digital scale, zero everything out, and you're going to add 30 grams of water into your jar. Once your water is added, you're going to make sure that you stir it very, very, very well, making sure that all flour is fully hydrated and there are no dry clumps remaining. All right, so once everything is all mixed in, there's no dry clumps of flour remaining. Turn it upside down, look at the bottom, make sure everything is definitely absorbed and hydrated. Now, what if it's not? What if there's like a little bit of flour, maybe kind of in the middle, and it looks like it's all mixed up, but it really isn't? It's fine. So the way that I like to look at this step is, okay, so when we eat a meal, in order to help our body digest it more, we chew it, right? That is one of the first steps of digestion, actually. So I like to look at it in the same way for our sourdough starter. By making sure that the flour is fully hydrated by the water, is just kind of like that same making sure that our food is chewed before we swallow it, so our body can digest it. I like to just make sure that everything here is fully absorbed so that the wild yeast and the lactic acid bacteria can eat the food that I am giving it. So we're going to put our lid on top, and then you're going to put on an elastic, and it's just going to tell you what time you want to come and check it every single day. So mine has everything written on it. If yours doesn't, you could just use an elastic band, put a little piece of paper, and write down the time on that. That's fine. If you don't have one of these little thermometers, that's okay too. This is just another way that we can make sure that everything stays at that consistent temperature. So we are Wednesday at about 10:30, so I am just going to place that there. Now I am going to place mine in a nice warm spot, and I'm going to leave it alone until I start to see bubbles forming, and that could take anywhere between 1 to 3 days. Now I will meet you on my countertop for when it is time to do our first feeding and signs that you need to look for. Now, one thing that I do want to preface this with, so my sourdough starter that I'm making, because it is sitting beside my other sourdough starters that I already have, as well as this is an apple cider vinegar that I'm making from scratch. This corner, there's a lot of fermentation going on. There's a lot of just different things with my lactic acid bacteria. Mine might go faster than yours just based on its surrounding. So don't take into consideration how many days mine necessarily is going to take and base yours off of it. Just follow the same instructions that I'm giving you. Mine just might go quicker because there's a lot of sourdough things going on in this corner. Once your sourdough starter is beginning to show some signs of activity, and our activity is going to be little bubbles, it's time to do our first discard and feeding. So I'm going to show you what you're looking for. So if you just look on the top, we have some very little bubbles that are starting to form. If you look, there's some along the sides. If you flip it over, there's some on the bottom. That is exactly what you're looking for. So what we're going to do is you want to grab your digital scale. We're going to turn it on, and you're going to grab your second jar. And we are just going to figure out how much this jar weighs. So mine is 393 grams, and we write that just on the bottom. This way, when it's time to take out of this jar to do another discard, we know how much the jar weighs, and then it is easier to figure out then. So what we're going to do is you hit tear. We're going to zero out our scale, and then you're going to take 30 grams of this starter and put it in your clean jar. So before you dump any out, I want you to just take a spatula or whatever implement you're using to stir, and then just give this a nice good stir. So once we have it nicely stirred, 30 grams goes into the jar. Now, because this is not ready, anything that you have left over is just going to be thrown in the garbage. We cannot use it yet. So once you have your 30 grams of sourdough starter in your jar, hit your tear button on your scale to zero it out, and then you're going to grab that flour blend that we made up, and you're going to measure out 30 grams of our flour and throw it right into that jar. As you can see, I accidentally put 31 in, so I'm just going to scoop out a little bit. It's okay. As long as the flour didn't get wet from the starter, it's okay to just put it back in the jar if you just put a little too much in. Because this is the flour I'm going to be using, so if a little bit did go in, it would be okay. So now you're going to hit your tear button again, zero it out, and this time you're going to add 30 grams of water. And this is just the room temperature water that I've had sitting on my counter. And then you're just going to grab your spatula, and we're going to give this a nice good stir so everything is fully incorporated. Always be sure to check the bottom of your jar to make sure that everything is nicely mixed. Now, one other thing that I like to do just to keep the sides of my jar clean at this point is to just grab a little piece of paper towel and just wipe any residue that might be left above the jar. This way it's just going to be easier so that you can tell when it actually starts to raise and fall down, but that will take some time. Perfect, so that is good enough like that. We are going to replace our lid, put on your elastic band so that you can see where the sourdough starter is. We don't have very much in here, so just put it down close to the bottom as possible. Grab your thermometer. We are Friday at 8:30 a.m. Perfect. So yeah, mine did take 2 days for it to start having our little bubbles and being active. That's fine. It's going to take anywhere between 1 and 3 days. You are going to come back every 24 hours and repeat this step where you discard it down to 30 grams and then add 30 grams of our flour blend and 30 grams of water. And you're going to continually doing that until our starters begins to rise and fall on a more regular basis. I will meet you back here when it is time to do our next round of steps. Now, I do want to just mention one thing. This particular step where we are going to be feeding it every 24 hours at our 1:1:1 ratio could take a few days to a few weeks to be complete before it is time to move on to the next step. Remember, at the beginning of this video, I did say this was going to be a very honest tutorial. So we're not going to rush it. We are going to practice our patience, and before you know it, your sourdough starter will be ready and you can make some delicious bread. Once your starter begins to rise and fall consistently, it's time to go on to the next step. So the next step is we are going to start feeding it every 12 hours, that same ratio. 30 grams starter, 30 grams of our flour mixture, and 30 grams of water. Okay, and we're going to allow it to stay on this step for another 1 to 4 weeks. Now, somewhere within this 1 to 4 weeks that are coming up, you're going to decide when you want to try doing the float test. Now, while this particular test does have its limitations, it is a way that you can gauge if your starter is ready to use or not. Around that same time that you're ready to perform the float test, if you have them, I'm going to suggest using some pH strips, or if you have a pH meter. Now, the reason we would want to potentially check the pH is because we are wanting to make sure that our sourdough starter is below 4.1, because that means that we are having an environment that our pathogenic bacteria simply cannot survive in. Now, it's once your starter reaches this point that you're actually able to start keeping the discard and using that in future recipes. Now, I don't personally keep discard, and I will talk about why in a moment, but this is when you definitely could if that's what you're wanting to do. Now is also a really good time, if you haven't come up with one by now, but naming your sourdough starter is also part of this process. Now, I've been calling mine Jane Sourdough. That's simply because I actually don't have any plans on keeping Jane once she is mature and established. I have enough sourdough starters. I am going to be passing her on to a new home, and they can give her her final name. Once your starter is established at this point, keep in mind it's going to take a few more weeks of feeding it for it to be mature, but established is where we want to be right now. You're going to need to make a decision on what type of flour blend you're going to be using from this point on. So you could either use a mixture like I'm going to. So I have in here 75% all-purpose flour and 25% rye flour. Now, if you wanted, you could just do 100% all-purpose, and that would be okay. I just find through my own trial and error that I like my starters to have a little bit of rye flour in there. There's a lot of science behind it, but it also comes down to personal preference. So once you hit this point where our starter is established, we've decided we are going to do either our 75 AP 25% rye or 100% AP flour, whichever you prefer. You're going to need to then change your starter feeding ratio. So I have two different suggestions here. We could feed it at a 1 to 5 to 5. So that means that you would use 30 grams of starter, 150 grams of flour, and 150 grams of water. This is recommended if you are only wanting to feed your starter once a day. If you are going to be feeding it once a day, but you do want to use discard in a lot of your recipes, do that higher amount that I talked about. Keep your starter with 30 starter, 150 flour, 150 water. But if you don't want to do that and you don't want to go through that much flour, consider keeping a tiny starter, which are the ones that I like to keep. And we'll talk about the exact feeding ratio of these two starters that I have. But if you are wanting to follow a 1 to 5 to 5 ratio in a tiny starter, you would use 5 grams of starter, 25 grams of flour, and 25 grams of water. And that will be enough. That will be your 1 to 5 to 5. And that should last your sourdough a full 24 hours to get through that before it needs to go on to the next feeding. So if a 1 to 5 to 5 ratio is something that's going to last your starter 24 hours before it's going to be needing to be fed again, what if you wanted to feed your starter twice a day? If you feed it twice a day, it will be happier than if you're just feeding it once a day, but just once a day at 1 to 5 to 5 is perfectly fine. So if you're going to feed it twice a day, I'm going to suggest a 1 to 2 to 2 ratio. So that would either be 30 grams of starter, 60 grams of flour, and 60 grams of water, or if you were wanting to keep a tiny starter, 10 grams of starter, 20 grams of flour, and 20 grams of water, just as long as you have twice as much water and flour as you do starter. So once your starter is established, you are ready to bake that first loaf of bread. Now, I want to just give you a little bit of a word of caution here. An established starter does not mean it is a mature starter, and your first few loaves of bread might actually turn out less than desired, and that just means that your starter is weak and it just needs more feedings. My best suggestion that I can give you when it comes to making your own sourdough starter and when it comes to feeding it is you're going to have to learn how to read the starter. You're going to have to determine if what you're feeding it is the starter happy or is it not? Is it not behaving as you think that it should? So now that you have your starter that you have established and you are working on making it completely mature, there are some other starter maintenance suggestions that I'm going to just share. I will be covering these more in a future video. I don't want things to get too confusing, but I just want to show you that there is a lot of room for movement here, and it's really going to depend on what your starters prefer. So for the two that I have going right now, I have Rylene. She was made with rye flour and she's maintained with mainly rye flour. She's at a 75% rye flour to 25% all-purpose, and I feed her at a 1 to 4 to 4. So that means that I have 5 grams of sourdough starter, 20 grams of flour, and then 20 grams of water. And as you can see, she is hungry. I fed her last night. I will give her another feeding as soon as I'm done recording this video. But remember how I've said that different flours absorb water at different rates? That's kind of what's happening here. So this works out to a little bit more of a semi-stiff starter as opposed to a liquid starter, which is what a lot of us are familiar with. My other sourdough starter, this is Sandy. She is fed at a 1 to 4 to 2.4. So she's actually a stiff starter is what we would refer to her as. And that just means I have 5 grams of starter, 20 grams of flour, and 12 grams of water, and I mix that in a separate bowl. You do have to knead this one slightly by hand and then just put her back in her jar, and she expands in the same way as if she were a liquid starter. And all I do out of either of these when I am ready to make my bread, I just mix a 100% hydration levain, which means I have the same percentage of flour and water in my jar. But don't worry, I will definitely be covering that in future videos. I just wanted to give you a little bit more information on things that you will need to know once you get all of this base stuff figured out. All right, we've talked about starter maintenance. Let's talk about starter storage. I personally store my starters on the cupboard regardless of if I'm going to be baking with them or not. There's some weeks I don't even bake. I will just feed them once to twice a day and it's okay. So a thing that you can do though is you can keep your starter in the refrigerator. This is not my recommended way of storage, but I'm not going to tell you how to run your kitchen. I'm just going to tell you what I like to do, and then you can make your own decisions if that's going to also work for you or what would work best for you in your kitchen. Storing your starter in the refrigerator is a method that is typically used by somebody who bakes once a week, maybe twice a week, maybe every other week. So if you do follow this method, give your starter at least 2, ideally up to 5 feedings after you take it out of the fridge before you go to use it, and that's going to help adjust the acidity and wake it up from its dormant state before you start baking with it. We can't put our starter in the fridge and make it all sleepy, get those yeasts in that more of a suspended state of animation rather than just ready to go and ready to be eating. And then we take our starter out of the fridge and then we get upset that it's not performing optimally when it's really just still trying to wake up. So that's why I don't like to keep mine in the fridge. Why would I put it in a suspended state of animation? Why would I put those yeasts to sleep? Why would I slow everything down just to take it out to expect it to bake as if it was staying on the counter? If you are going to follow this method, there is nothing wrong with it. Many bakers across the world put their starters in the fridge. That's just not something that I prefer doing. But if you were going to do it, you would feed your starter, allow it to sit at room temperature for 1 to 2 hours, and then place it in the fridge. And you would want to repeat that once a week just to keep it healthy. Let's talk about sourdough discard. Like I mentioned a few moments ago, I just throw mine out. I feel the flour has been used, it's been spent, it's been eaten. I don't need it anymore. And if I am wanting to make a recipe with sourdough discard, I will just build a levain and use active starter. I'm also going to mention I have not come across a sourdough discard recipe that I was really all that impressed with anyways, so I just prefer to use active starter in all of my recipes as opposed to discard. If you were wanting to keep sourdough discard though, you would want to keep it for about 5 days before you want to get rid of it. So I know that was a lot of information that I've given you. Feel free to come back to this video. I will have it chaptered. You can check out a specific part if you need a refresher. You will also find in the description box below this video a link to the full written blog article, so you can see this all in writing if you don't want to come back and watch the video. But we've now reached the notes and suggestions portion of this video, where I have some additional notes and other suggestions that you might want to consider and to keep in mind. First of all, expect this process to take a minimum of 11 days all the way up to like a month for your starter to be established and matured and ready to use. So we need to think about this. Why are we wanting to rush using a sourdough starter when we are using beneficial bacteria to leaven dough? Why would we want to rush this? Why would we want to run the risk of some of those pathogenic bacteria still being in there? Okay, we need to give our sourdough starter enough time so that those bacteria, the yeast, and the acids can all bounce themselves out. Trust me, your bread will not work until everything is all balanced out. A temperature of 70 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit is ideal when it comes to encouraging activity. Now, you can definitely play around with your starter once it has become established. So if you were wanting a more sour or acid taste to your bread, you would want to consider keeping it at 80 degrees Fahrenheit from feeding to usage. So there are different ways that you can play around with the temperature that is going to play a factor in your finished loaf of bread. Always use a kitchen scale to ensure that you are discarding and adding the appropriate amount of ingredients. Now I'm going to suggest that you avoid using antibacterial soap on any of your equipment, because if there is a slight residue left behind from the soap, that can interfere with the developing starter. So all you'll really need to do once you go to clean your jars, I like to wipe out as much as I can with a spatula, take a paper towel, wipe it out, and then just rinse it out with hot water, and that's good enough. When you're feeding your starter, always make sure that you're stirring it really vigorously, because you do want to introduce oxygen into the environment, because that helps with the process as well. Always consider keeping a tiny starter just so that you're not going through large amounts of flour on days that you're not baking. Remember, the different flours will absorb water differently, and this comes down to brand. So one brand of rye flour or all-purpose flour will absorb water differently than what a different brand will. So if you are switching up brands of flour at all during this process, that's fine. Just keep an eye if you need to adjust that water amount. I know that you can get discouraged during this process, because I certainly have, and I've thrown in the towel far too early before I really gave it a chance. But remember, as long as you are seeing even one bubble, your starter is still active. If you end up changing something, whether that's brand of flour, timing of feeding, whatever it is, and your starter isn't behaving as you expect it would, just go back to the last step and be patient. Just give it some more time. So once your starter is fully matured, let's give it a couple months before you're going to do this. You may want to create yourself a bit of an insurance policy. So that's what these are. So basically, they are just small amounts of sourdough starter that I've taken and dehydrated, so that if anything was to happen to these ones, I still have little bits of them here, and they just need to be rehydrated at that point. Now, another thing that you can do, you can make pre-fermented flour out of sourdough starter. So what I did is I just took my dried starter and I put it through a blender, and it gave me something like this, which is pre-fermented flour. Now, keep in mind, this is not, you couldn't just take this and expect that this is going to give you sourdough bread. You would actually need to bring it back through this process and have a starter and make your levain and go that way. But you can put up to 10% of pre-fermented flour into any other recipe, and it's not going to turn it into sourdough, but it will give you some of those health benefits by just ingesting pre-fermented flour and what that could give you. But don't worry, I will have a video in the future on the entire process on dehydrating and making your own pre-fermented flour. So there you have it, folks. That is how easy it actually is to make your own sourdough starter. Yes, it is simple. Yes, it is a practice in patience. And yes, I wholeheartedly believe that you can do this. So don't forget to hit the like button if you've liked this video, or share it with anyone else who you think might enjoy it. Consider subscribing to the channel so that we can spend more time together and that you don't miss future videos. But I just want to say thanks for stopping by today, and I'll see you next time.